The Light of the Blue Pearl by Hawke. Narrated by Katsember. Chapter 1. Ethne stared up at the ceiling while lying lifeless on the couch. Not terribly comfortable, but not caring much either, she thought to herself, "What now?" The day was only half over, and yet nothing of importance had happened. Nothing ever really did. Life had become mundane and empty. It wasn't a bad life by definition, but not a very exciting one either. She felt the softness of the pillow with her head and tried ever so hard to think of what she should be doing. The house was a mess. She should clean it, but couldn't bring herself to even care to get up. It was quiet. All she could hear was the wind blowing through a wind chime outside. "I should be enjoying this peace," she said to herself. But instead she felt sad and empty, close to tears. "I'm better than this. Get up, you stupid woman. Do something with your day. What's wrong with you?" she said to herself. No one answered. No one ever did. She was alone, as usual, and although this was by choice, it was this alone feeling that kept her body firmly planted on the soft couch. Just then someone knocked loudly on her door, making her nearly jump out of her skin. No one ever visited or came to her door, so this was an unexpected shock, and it took her a moment to gather herself up and head to the door to see who it could be, her heart pounding a bit from the unexpected disturbance. Living alone always makes a young woman slightly nervous. She lived in a nice area, though, so she had never feared for her safety. All the same, she took a peek to see who it was, and was slightly shocked to see no one there. A prank, she figured. Nothing more than a prank. Why on earth had I thought it could actually be anything interesting? Nothing interesting ever happened to her. She was as average as they come, invisible to pretty much everyone alive. Or so it seemed to her, anyway. She slowly made her way back to the couch, but stopped short when she heard something being pushed under the door. She turned around to see an envelope now laying on her floor, average size, light blue, with no writing on it. Intrigued, she picked up the envelope and turned it over in her fingers, inspecting it. It wasn't addressed to anyone, so she assumed it was probably just a stupid solicitation, like the ones left on her doorstep from time to time. This was a bit more brazen of them to violate the inside of her walls by pushing it under the door, but it was probably just junk all the same. For no other reason, other than lack of anything else to do, she decided to open it before throwing it away. Inside the envelope was the most beautiful paper with elegant writing on it that was so stunning to look at, she actually forgot to read it at first, staring dumbly, almost frozen in her foyer. After a time, she focused her eyes on the writing and started to decipher what it said. To the girl with the sad eyes. You have exactly 1 hour to make your way to 2298 Market Street. Don't be late. She looked at her watch. It was 4 o'clock and she had to be at work by 6. The destination was clear on the other side of town. The odds of making both destinations on time were slim. If she didn't go to work, she was likely to lose her job. But what else could she do? Nothing excitingly strange had ever happened to her before, and she was intrigued. To the girl with the sad eyes. Who on earth has been paying attention to my eyes? Or me, for that matter, she said aloud to no one in particular. Before she gave it even another thought, she was on her phone calling her boss. "Hello?" Imitating her best sick voice, she coughed and said, "Hi, Scott?" "Ethne, is that you? You sound terrible." "Yeah, I feel it. I don't think I can make it in tonight." "Oh, that's a shame. We were already short a person tonight. But if you're sick, you're sick. Get some rest. We'll see you tomorrow," he said, shocking her a bit with what sounded like genuine concern. "Okay, thanks," she replied before hanging up the phone. Now with that decided, she rushed to put on some clothes so she could do as the letter said and not be late for her 5 o'clock meeting. Scrambling to her room, she grabbed her blue jeans and pulled them on, almost falling over from her clumsiness and excitement of where she was about to go. She threw on her favorite green shirt, quickly ran a brush through her long brown hair, checked the mirror, and stuck out her tongue at herself. "Not much I could do here," she said, before grabbing her purse and keys and heading out the door to her blue Corolla. As she drove to 2298 Market Street, she was trying to think of what the address could be, She didn't have any recollection of it, though she rarely drove to that side of town anyway, so why would she? It typically took about 25 minutes to get there, which was way too long for the anticipation she felt, especially since she only had 10 more minutes before she would be late. I barely even fixed myself up. How was it possibly this late already? She mumbled to herself as she began to see the brake lights in front of her. You have got to be kidding me. There's never any traffic this direction usually, and now brake lights? Come on! Can't anything ever work out? She said to herself, clearly frustrated but with no option but to try and stay calm. Now she was going to be late, miss work, and still have absolutely no idea what the note was all about, and die from curiosity, probably. In addition to that, she had no idea what would happen if she was late. The note didn't exactly specify. The brake lights soon cleared, and she was on her way again with a huge sigh of relief. Maybe I can still make it, she breathed. As she closed in on 2298 Market Street, she saw that there was a coffee shop on the corner of it. How cliché, she said to herself. Oh well, time to go see what this is all about. She parked her car, unlatched her seatbelt, and realized her hands were shaking a bit. Probably won't be needing coffee, she said as she got out of her car and crossed the street to the coffee shop. Outside, there were nice tables and chairs with umbrellas and many patrons enjoying a cup of coffee and some food. She scanned the area and saw a man sitting by himself reading a book, his legs crossed in a very casual manner. He looked up, saw her, and waved her over. She tentatively walked over to the man and shyly said, "Hello?" "Are you Ethne?" the man asked. Yes," she answered, still having absolutely no idea what was going on. "I was told to give you this," he said, reaching out and handing her another envelope, same color, different size. He looked back down at his book and continued to read as if she wasn't even standing there anymore. She quietly said thank you and walked back to her car. After getting back into her car, she felt like she was in a daze, not even feeling quite like herself. What is going on here? She thought to herself as she looked down at the envelope in her hands. Slowly opening it, she found an airline ticket from San Francisco to Belize City. Belize? What the hell? Next to the round-trip ticket was another note. It simply said, "You'll be gone 3 days. Make arrangements." Okay, a trip across town was one thing, but an airplane ticket? This was getting a bit ridiculous. She couldn't possibly. What would she tell her boss? How could she even pull this off, and was it safe? She had absolutely no idea what any of this was all about, and now she was supposed to travel to a foreign country? Right now? No, she couldn't, could she? All of these thoughts were frantically going through her mind as she was trying to decide. She looked at the airplane ticket and saw that the flight was in 2 hours. Not much time to go home and pack. Would she need much anyway? Of course she would. She put the key into the ignition and started driving home, figuring she would make up her mind on the way. As she pulled into her driveway, she still hadn't made up her mind. Weighing the pros and cons all the way home, she couldn't really come to a conclusive decision of whether or not she should go. She felt like throwing all of it out the window and just going, no more weighing options. It was then she realized her decision had been made. She was going. With her mind made up and feeling a bit exhilarated at the idea, she climbed out of her car and started walking up the stairs to her door. As she got closer to her door, she realized there was something there waiting for her. It was a suitcase, a small black suitcase with a note attached. Everything you'll need. She stood stunned for a moment, not really knowing why. A suitcase waiting at her door wasn't any more unusual than all the other stuff that had already happened that day. Unlocking her door, she picked up the suitcase and carried it inside. Placing the suitcase on her bed, she unzipped it, extremely curious about what could possibly be in it. Well organized and expertly packed, she almost didn't want to disturb its contents, but her curiosity wasn't going to let her leave it be. Who was she kidding? Besides the typical items, toothbrush, toothpaste, shampoo, etc., there were also some gorgeous clothes, obviously brand new, some with the tags still on. The purpose of that a bit confusing since she couldn't exactly take anything back or change sizes, having no idea where the stuff came from anyway. There were just a few items of clothing, which made sense since she wasn't going to be gone very long. It was probably wise that whoever did this packed for her. She would have overpacked for herself anyway. There was a beautiful dress with white lilies on it that she could tell right away was going to look stunning, and even a pair of shoes to go with it. The idea that someone knew her size and shoe size was a bit unnerving, actually. Her curiosity suddenly started to take a turn towards fear at the awkwardness of it all. Who could possibly know these things about her? No one ever noticed her, talked to her, spent time with her. She really didn't have any friends to speak of, not really. No one who really knew her like that anyway. In a way, she found that sad, but she had her reasons. However, it made what was happening now that much more intriguing. She decided to put her fears aside and just see where this was going. Never taking time to travel and usually spending all of her time at work, the idea of flying somewhere new was extremely liberating and terrifying. After inspecting the other clothes inside, some nice shorts, a few shirts, and a swimsuit that had her immediately nervous, she zipped it closed and headed for her car. Her heart began to race when she realized she was really going to do this. She was on her way to the airport to get on an airplane for only the second time in her life and head to a country she knew absolutely nothing about. She didn't know why she was going in the first place and had no idea what to expect. Truly a bit of an adventure, she made her way to the airport and found a place to park her car for the night. Never having any dealings at the airport, navigating all of the lanes and confusing parking situations, she hoped she found the right place to park and that her car would be there waiting for her when she got back. Pulling into her parking spot, the evening air was a comfortable temperature and the full moon was just starting to rise over the horizon. If she hadn't been where she was now, she would have missed such a beautiful scene. I work too much, she thought to herself. Grabbing the suitcase from her back seat, Ethne locked the doors and started making her way to where the transit bus would pick her up and take her to the terminal. She was the only one waiting, which made her nervous being so unaccustomed to air travel. She hoped she was doing things right. After a few moments, a bus pulled up and she got inside. Just her and the driver on their way to the airport. She felt a little strange climbing the stairs. The driver glanced at her and gave her a look that made her feel a little uncomfortable. This whole thing is making me paranoid, she thought. It was a quick 5-minute drive to the airport, and before she knew it, she was getting off and making her way to the terminal. She had her ticket in her hand, gripping it like it was a rope that was keeping her from falling off a cliff. Once in line, she set her suitcase down and started for the first time to think about what it was she was doing. That's when the panic set in. Chapter 2. She felt the cold sweat kick in and her palms start to feel sticky. If she had been looking in the mirror, she was sure a pale white ghost would be staring back at her. Someone in front of her asked, "You okay, hun?" She barely even heard them and decided she'd better sit down. With nowhere to sit, she had to sit on the ground right there in line, getting up each time it moved. Her head was racing. What was she doing? Where was she going? And a plane ride? The thought of it just now sinking in. She had only flown once before to Europe to visit a sick relative, and that hadn't gone very well now that she thought of it. And now she was going to get on a plane and go to another country, all by herself? This was crazy. She couldn't do this. She had almost talked herself out of going when the airport security officer called, "Next?" She was next. She somehow managed to stand up and grab her suitcase and bring it closer to the screening counter. It felt like it had gained several pounds since the last time she had lifted it. "Ticket and ID?" the officer asked. Ethne handed them over, the officer having to pry them from her sticky and clenched palm. As she inspected them for accuracy, she looked up at Ethne, assessing the pale individual in front of her. "First time flying?" she asked. "Second," Ethne replied. "Well, you'll be all right. There's a bathroom just over there if you want to freshen up before you board." "Thank you," Ethne said, not sure that any time spent in the bathroom was going to fix how she was feeling right now. After making it through security, Ethne slowly made her way to the bathroom to see what the damage was. Setting her bag on the counter, she looked in the mirror and saw her pale face looking back at her. "What are you doing?" she said to herself. She unzipped the bag and saw a note that she had somehow missed before. She pulled it out and leaned against the counter to read it. "You're probably feeling a bit unsure about this trip right now. Don't worry, you'll be glad you went." Well, whoever wrote that note was dead on in their assessment. She was definitely feeling unsure about her decision to fly to Belize. Belize. What on earth could be there waiting for me? She thought to herself, glancing one more time in the mirror before she dug into her bag for reinforcements. Slowly reapplying her makeup to try to bring a little color back to her face, she looked in the mirror and decided that was the best she could do, given what she had to work with. A ghost is a ghost, no matter how much you try to dress it up. She looked at herself in the mirror for a second before leaving, noticing how skinny she had gotten. Her brown hair was just past her shoulders again after she'd cut it months earlier, a huge mistake she had found out later. Her face was pale, though today a little paler than normal. Looking deeply into her own sad eyes, she saw what the person had meant. Though she never thought much of her features, and up until now apparently no one else had either, she wouldn't say she was ugly. She saw her mother's face when she looked in the mirror, a small nose with strong cheekbones, except her lips. Those were full like her father's had been. Overall, in her mind, she was just average. Average height, average look, average life. But she could imagine that if she had a little more life behind her brown eyes, maybe then she'd be worth looking at. Her flight was going to board in a few minutes, so she picked up her bag and started heading towards the gate. On her way there, she was tempted to grab something to eat. She hadn't eaten much all day, but frankly her stomach was a bit too unsettled, so she opted against it. She decided now was the time to make the dreaded phone call to her boss to break the news that she wouldn't be at work tomorrow either. "Hello?" Scott answered. Feigning a weak voice, she said, "Hi, Scott. It's Ethne. I'm really not feeling well. I don't think I'm going to be able to come in tomorrow either." "Oh? That's a shame," Scott replied. "Well, I guess we will see you on Monday then, since you're off until then anyway. Hope you feel better." "Thanks," she said, before hanging up the phone, feeling a bit terrible about the deception. But she didn't want to lose her job, so there was really no other way around it. As she walked up to the gate, the line wasn't all that long, which was nice, she supposed, considering the fact that she was unsure how this flight was going to go. The least amount of spectators to what might happen en route, the better, she figured. When it was her turn in line, she handed her ticket to the woman, smiled a faint smile, and was soon taking the long walk to the plane's door. With every step, it seemed her heart started pounding faster and faster. It probably was. She did her best to ignore it, but when it came time to actually step foot onto the plane, she froze. Her foot seriously wouldn't move. It was inches from the plane's door, but she couldn't take a step further. The people behind her started to get antsy, and one of them even tried to push her, but to no avail. She wasn't going anywhere. It didn't take long before one of the flight attendants came to her aid and tried to reassure her that things would be fine. She looked deep into the woman's blue eyes and tried to comprehend what she was saying to her, but everything had gone silent. Oh no, it's happening, Ethne thought. She tried to take a deep breath. About halfway was the best she could muster. Not quite enough oxygen needed to stay conscious. She started to feel the room go black. Someone behind her caught her arm and helped steady her as the flight attendant moved her off to the side so that everyone else could board the plane. She leaned against the wall for support and hung her head low, trying not to faint. Another flight attendant brought her some water and helped her drink it. "You gonna be okay, hun?" one of them asked. She honestly didn't know, but she nodded her head that she would, and pretty soon the room started to look normal again. With her bearings established once more, she took a deep breath and decided it was now or never. She had two options. 1, get on the plane and see where this strange note would take her, or 2, go home. Having seen enough of home, she stepped onto the plane. The aisles were narrow, which she remembered from the last flight. She didn't care for narrow, but she had committed, and so she would see this through, even if it killed her. The flight attendant who had brought her the water was right behind her, carrying her bag for her and making sure her newest passenger was well taken care of. Her seat was mid-plane, just in front of the wing, a window. Not really liking being on a plane to begin with, she wasn't sure it mattered which seat she was in. She honestly couldn't wait to get off. But this was a long flight, with a couple of layovers. It was going to be a while before she got her wish. The flight attendant put her bag in the compartment above her and handed her a pillow and blanket. "Are you feeling a little better?" she asked Ethne. "Yeah, a little," she answered. "My name is Robin if you need anything, okay?" she said with a nervous smile on her face. Ethne assumed that they dealt with nervous flyers all of the time, but doubted that they enjoyed it much. "Yeah, okay, thanks," she answered, gladly accepting the blanket and pillow. She hadn't had much time to get to the airport and had pretty much handed her ticket over just a few minutes before takeoff, so it wasn't long before they were underway and the plane was taxiing up the runway. She was gripping the armrest with white knuckles, trying to breathe deeply, but wasn't having much luck. There was no one sitting next to her, which again was probably a good thing. Not only would she likely be terrifying them because of her nervousness, but in case something happened, she didn't want anyone nearby anyway. She forced herself to look out the window and think about other things. The note from the morning was still in her pocket. She pulled it out and started studying the paper and the handwriting, trying to see if there were any clues as to who might have written it. She didn't find any. She didn't recognize the handwriting at all. She couldn't think for the life of her who could have sent it and who had convinced her to travel so far from home. The plane was done taxiing and was starting to pick up speed as it raced down the runway before taking the final leap into the air. Ethne closed her eyes and tried to ignore what was happening, which was very difficult because it was so loud and so turbulent her mind could think of nothing else. Soon, though, they were up and things started to level out. She was in the air. Flying over her home, she took a quick glance down at the city below. She had such a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach at the bizarre turn of events of the day. This morning I was sitting on my couch staring at the ceiling, she thought to herself. Now I'm flying to Belize. I must be crazy. Perhaps she was, but considering the kind of life she'd had up to this point, she doubted anyone would blame her. Living alone all of those years, spending her time only working and passing the time, this was probably the most exciting thing she had ever done. She was terrified. She thought about what she was going to do once she landed, but decided not to even think about that because it brought on even more panic than the flight was. So instead, she got up, got her bag down, and rummaged through it for entertainment. She discovered another note. How do I keep missing these? She thought. Unfolding the note, she read the 3 words on it. Take a nap. Take a nap, she thought. Oh yeah, that was hilarious. Like she could even think about sleeping right now. Not only did she have an extremely anxiety-driven flight ahead of her, but then, after she landed, she had no idea what was awaiting her. Take a nap. Yeah, right. Sleeping on a plane never held much appeal for her anyway. It certainly hadn't benefited her the last time she'd flown. Just then the flight attendant walked by and asked if she wanted anything to drink. What she really wanted was something to take away her anxiety, but alcohol wasn't really an option, so she declined and went back to contemplating her fate upon arrival in Belize City. The note stayed with her, though. Everything else had been something for her to do, so perhaps taking a nap was essential for some strange reason. So, fighting everything in her that wanted to stay awake, Ethne wrapped her arms tightly around herself and closed her eyes. Chapter 3. The first time he had seen her sad eyes was the day he nearly fell over her in the hallway. She had dropped her purse and was bent down to pick it up. He was in a rush and hadn't even seen her while he was juggling paperwork and his cell phone. The halls can be quite dangerous if you aren't keeping your eyes open. He tripped over her and went flying into the wall, dropping all of his belongings as well. She blushed and immediately apologized for being in his way and started helping him pick up his things. He felt like a total ass since it had been his fault for not paying attention to where he was going in the first place. He was at a loss for words. He felt so stupid for having tripped over her. After they quietly finished picking up all of his papers, he asked if she was all right. She gave him a small smile, shrugged her shoulders and said she was fine before picking up her purse and walking away. It wasn't the first time he had seen her, of course. It was just the first time he had noticed her. He wasn't sure how she had escaped his gaze before, since after looking into her eyes that day, he couldn't seem to think of anything else. He made an effort to speak to her after that, but she typically kept the conversations very short and was obviously trying not to be bothered. Not doing much for his self-esteem, he wasn't sure why he wanted to pursue it, but something in her eyes had him so intensely captivated he could think of little else. After about a week of thinking about her and failing miserably at trying to strike up a real conversation, he came up with an idea. She was a difficult one, shy and reserved, but incredibly smart. He could tell that she was keeping everyone at a distance on purpose, and he decided he had to find out what that reason was. Naturally a problem solver, this was a puzzle he couldn't leave unfinished, so he set out to work on his elaborate plan. It took him a while to iron out all of the details, and there were a lot of details, but after he was quite proud of himself at its cleverness. It would take an interesting person to do the things that he had planned, but he had a hunch that she was indeed an interesting and rare person. The next day he had put his plan into action. He was so nervous it wasn't going to work, that everything he had just spent forever dreaming up and scheduling was going to go to waste. Really, who in their right mind would travel somewhere with no notice and no explanation, he thought to himself. It was outlandish, totally ridiculous to even consider. He had a sinking feeling his efforts were going to fail before the plan was set in motion, that this may be a puzzle that would go unsolved. That was a thought he couldn't stand. Not being the type to ever leave a puzzle undone, he was already thinking of other ways to get the answers he was looking for when he heard the telephone ring down the hall. The conversation wasn't long and not much had been said, but her name being pulled from the work schedule that night was confirmation for him that the first step had worked. Whether or not she would follow through with the second step of his plan was a completely different question, though. It was quite a bit to ask of a person, really, and for her he knew it was going to be a gigantic challenge. What was he thinking? He thought to himself. He knew very little of her past, but enough to know that the next part of his plan was going to be a gigantic hurdle for her. He had probably shot himself in the foot with the idea, but this step he had decided was the catalyst to the rest, a necessary piece that couldn't be left out. If she could do it, it would answer so many of his questions without any words being exchanged. Now, with the first challenge met, all he could do was wait. Unfortunately, waiting was really not something he was good at. He was pacing the halls waiting to see if she came into work after all, waiting for another sign that the next step was going to be taken. He would have given anything to have been a fly on the wall of where she was, but that wasn't possible. The most important part of his plan was that she couldn't know it was him sending her on what probably seemed to her a wild-goose chase. After about a half an hour, he made a phone call and discovered that the first envelope had been received, opened, and read. It was the closest he could be to being a fly on the wall. The complete stranger on the phone had been very kind to accept his offer of delivering the envelope. Though he'd had to compensate and convince him some, that wasn't unreasonable given the circumstances. The first domino has to start somewhere, and it had now been knocked over. His heart was racing, wondering if what she had read in the note was even something she would consider. He knew most people probably wouldn't have. Most would have thrown it away and ran. It was, after all, a bit insane. But something told him that she wasn't most people, that while it may seem outlandish at first, the idea in itself was exhilarating and intriguing. After that day in the hall, he felt maybe she needed a bit of that in her life. The sound of the phone ringing down the hall confirmed that he was right. She wasn't most people. She had accepted his offer and was soon going to be on her way to Belize. He stood shocked for a moment when he realized the beginning of his plan had been a success. He wasn't quite sure what to do with himself at that point. It was going to be a very long time until he got another update. What am I going to do with myself now? He thought. He certainly wasn't going to be able to sleep. The next hour or so was critical. This step was going to be so hard for her. He knew this when he planned it. But Belize was an integral part of everything. There was no other option. Still, even though he didn't know the whole story of what happened on her last plane ride, he knew flying wasn't at the top of her list because of it. He really wasn't sure how this was going to go. Half of him wanted to hop in the car and drive to the airport to help her get through it, but he couldn't. All he could do was wait and see if she was able to take this step on her own. While he waited for news, he decided to go over everything he had scheduled again to make sure nothing was left out, that he hadn't forgotten anything. Even the smallest of detail could mess this up. He was, after all, sending this poor girl to a foreign country, and for whatever reason, she was trusting him to take care of the details. The plans he had upon her return were just as important as this trip, even though he had tried to think of everything in advance. Truth be told, he was so excited about the first part and whether or not she would even take the bait. He had put more focus on it rather than the entire plan as a whole. So it was time to get back to work. While he held his breath waiting to hear news, there was nothing else he could do but set things in motion for her return to the States. He poured himself another cup of coffee, although he didn't really need it, and did his best to keep his mind off of what was happening at the airport. Chapter 4. Ethne was greatly surprised to find herself snuggled up in her blanket as she groggily came out of a deep sleep. Sleeping on a plane had never really been successful before. She hadn't thought she was going to be able to get any rest, but she must have been truly exhausted from the excitement of the day because it had taken no time at all to drift off. She slowly glanced around the cabin to see if she could make heads or tails of location or time. The cabin was quiet except for a few passengers coming and going to their seats. She must not have been the only tired traveler that day, although she doubted anyone on the plane was doing something as crazy as she was. Now that she was done running around town and facing her fears getting on a plane, for the first time all day she started to really think about what she was doing. With the excitement of receiving the first note, her mind had been abuzz all day, almost as if in a dream. But for the first time, the reality was sinking in. She had left her job, her responsibilities, and hopped on a plane without even a second thought as to why. It was a strange thing to be fulfilling the wishes of whoever was behind the notes, very likely a person she didn't even know. Her circles of friends was a dot, really. She had more connections at work than anything else, and even that was fairly non-existent. The choices she made to keep people at a distance were her own, but it never made it any easier when she thought about the things she was missing out on. Perhaps that reason alone was why she found herself sitting on a plane, traveling to a country she had never given a second thought to. Although she was excited and a bit nervous about what would happen when she landed, sitting there on the plane wrapped up in her blanket, she felt a sense of calm. That was a strange feeling to have given the circumstances. She leaned over and looked out the window. Although it was still dark, she could see faint lights below and some wisps of clouds as they traveled by. This experience was definitely different from the last time she had flown. "Do you need anything?" someone whispered to her. She had felt so alone in that moment, staring out the window, she had almost forgotten where she was. She slowly came back to reality and looked over to see the flight attendant looking down on her. I'm sorry, what?" Ethne asked. "I was just wondering if I could get you anything. You were asleep when we had brought the drinks around before. I didn't want to wake you, but I could get you something now if you like," Robin asked. "Oh, sure, I'll have some orange juice, thank you," she replied. "It's no problem. I'll be right back," Robin said, turning around and heading to the back of the plane. She must really be concerned about me, Ethne thought to herself. Although she hadn't flown much, she was pretty sure that serving drinks throughout an entire flight wasn't really customary. "Here you go," Robin said, quietly handing her a glass of orange juice and smiling before turning to leave. "Thanks," Ethne whispered, taking the drink from her hands before drinking it down in one gulp. She was not only thirsty, but famished. Hopefully it wouldn't be long before she could get some food, too. She had been too nervous to eat at the airport, but now her stomach was protesting loudly at the lack of sustenance. She wasn't accustomed to being at the whim of others, unable to just simply get herself a sandwich. Airline travel really wasn't her cup of tea. The flight attendant had been very kind, though, so she was going to do her best to be patient, albeit not her strongest of suits. To pass the time, which she figured was only about 3 hours into her 5-hour flight to her connecting flight in Miami, she decided to search the bag again. Unbuckling her seatbelt and pulling herself up out of the seat, she retrieved her bag from above. She sat back down and started rummaging through it, hoping to find something of interest to entertain her. 2 more hours on this flight wasn't that bad, really. Waiting in Miami forever wasn't going to be that thrilling, but it beat being stuck on an airplane for 12 or more hours. That was truly an inhumane experience. After rifling through her bag for a few minutes, she found her book she had thrown in last minute and an iPod with headphones. Unfortunately, there was nothing else in the bag to distract her, much to her disappointment. A little disheartened, she placed her bag up in the overhead compartment and sat down with her book and iPod in her lap. She was just about to pop the headphones in and try to forget the long wait she had to endure when the flight attendant showed up with some food. Once she had devoured her dinner, Ethne was feeling a bit groggy and figured sleeping was really the only option. She put the headphones in and did her best to get comfortable. It wasn't long before she was having an extremely vivid dream, completely unaware that she was 30,000 feet in the air. The sand felt cool beneath her feet, even though the hot sun was beating down on her. She raised her hand to shield her eyes and saw someone waving to her from a distance farther down the beach. She could see him smiling at her even though she couldn't make out who it was. She waved back and started walking towards him. At first, it felt like her feet weren't even moving, instead like she was gliding across the sand towards him. After a few minutes, she realized she must have been walking for hours but hadn't gotten anywhere. They were exactly the same distance apart, still unable to make out any features. She started looking around her in a panic, trying to see what could be keeping her from making any progress towards him. She looked down at her feet and saw that she was no longer standing in the sand. Looking up, she realized she was back in her hotel room, completely alone. When the plane touched down, Ethne was jolted awake from her dream and once again remembered where she was. She was kind of glad she'd been asleep for the descent. Landing was never her favorite thing, but for some reason the dream had left her a bit unsettled. It took forever for it to be her turn to get off the plane, and her legs were more than happy to finally be walking freely again. Once out into the airport, she went in search of more food, her stomach once again reminding her of its neglect. She found a restaurant not far from the terminal and found a table. After ordering a turkey sandwich, which was so much more up her alley than the airplane dinner had been, she started looking through a brochure of Belize that the flight attendant had handed her when she was leaving the plane. The pictures were gorgeous, but that wasn't unexpected. The place was, after all, a huge tourist attraction. She knew at least that much, even if it hadn't been on her bucket list. When she flipped to the last page of the brochure, there was a note stuck to it. It read, "Congratulations on making it this far. Go to the Hudson Nudes by gate D29. The man there has something for you." She had kind of forgotten about the notes with all of the excitement of the plane ride, but now it was back in the forefront of her mind what she was doing, following strange commands from written words on a page. In a way, though, it was nice to have something to do with the 5-hour wait she had in front of her. After finishing her sandwich and paying the waiter, she picked up her things and started making her way to Hudson News. It wasn't too far from where she had stopped for a bite to eat, which was good since the airport was massive and probably easy to get lost in. There was nobody at the counter when she walked up, so she waited, scanning the various magazines and newspapers. After a few minutes, a man walked in and stepped behind the counter and smiled. "Can I help you find something?" he asked. Yeah, I was told you have something for me," she said. "Are you Ethne?" he inquired. "Yeah," she responded quietly. "Well, here you go then." He pulled an envelope from underneath the counter and handed it to her. "Can I help you with anything else?" he asked. "No, not right now, thanks," she said, taking the envelope and scanning the front of it, which was blank. He responded with a smile and said, "Okay, well, let me know if you change your mind." "I will, thanks," she said, barely even looking up. As she walked away, she was already opening the envelope to see what was inside. This felt a bit like Christmas, and honestly, she couldn't remember the last time she was excited about something like that. She found a bench to sit on in a fairly calm part of the airport and started pulling out the contents. There was a small note, a hotel key, some money, and another airplane ticket. Oh, great, she thought. She had really hoped there wouldn't be any more flights after the next one, but here it was, right in her hands, another plane ride. She almost felt like throwing up. She seriously wasn't sure how she was still holding it together. She was so tired, so uneasy about her decision, and now even more so. She put the hotel key and money safely into her bag and started reading the note. "Once you've landed in Belize, you'll be flying on Tropic Air to get to San Pedro. It's a very short flight. Hang in there. Once you land, there will be a man waiting for you who will take you to your hotel. Go straight there." So particular. It was clear that there was to be no sightseeing upon arrival and that she was to specifically follow the instructions to the letter. And for whatever reason, she didn't feel like she should deviate from the instructions in any way. After all, the instructions were why she was there. If she didn't follow them, who knows where she would end up? Well, at least now she knew that when she landed she had a plan. That was comforting in a way. She put the note in her bag and decided to find a quiet place to rest and wait for her next flight. It was late, nearly 3 a.m., and even with the excitement, she was exhausted. She thought it wise to find a place close to her gate so she would hopefully not sleep through the departure. Laying her bag down and trying to find a comfortable position to sit in, she leaned up against the wall and closed her eyes. A couple of hours later, after having not slept at all, people started to line up at the gate. She found her place in line and got ready to make the next flight, not feeling any more confident than the last time. This time, though, she at least managed to get on the plane without making a spectacle and found her seat, thankful that this flight was a lot shorter than the last. She wasn't as lucky to be seated alone this time and found herself sitting down next to an attractive young man sitting by the window. It was then she realized how lucky she had been to have had the window seat the last time. Sitting in the aisle, she decided was not where she wanted to be. She started to feel her heart pound and her palms sweat. Crap, she thought. Are you all right? He asked, looking intently into her brown eyes. His own, an intriguing shade of blue and gray, caught her off guard. Yeah, I guess, she answered meekly. I don't really like to fly. Oh, he answered with concern on his face. Would you prefer the window seat? I don't mind changing with you. Really? She asked. You wouldn't mind? Nope, not at all, he said, standing up and preparing to help her into his seat. Thank you. That's very nice of you, she said. Don't mention it, he said, smiling and sitting back down. She immediately started feeling better at being able to see outside, rather than staring down the middle of the plane, a tube in her opinion that nobody should be in the first place. She wasn't sure if this was simply because of her last experience, or if she would have had this claustrophobia anyway. Either way, she was thankful to be sitting where she was. Feeling better? He asked. A little, she answered. Thank you. I'm Ian, by the way, he said, putting his hand out. Ethne, she said back, shaking his hand tentatively. Ethne? Really? That's pretty. Don't think I've heard that name before. She smiled back and shrugged, not really sure what to say. Conversations with other people didn't happen for her that often. This plus the nervousness about being on the plane was a little overwhelming, although there was something about him that made her feel at ease. Before long, the plane was taxiing to the runway and taking off for Belize. Ethne was doing her best to not act like a complete fool next to this person she had just met, but still she was hanging on pretty tightly to her armrest, which she was sure he noticed. He looked down at her hand once and just gave her a reassuring wink. Once they were in the air, she relaxed a bit and put her hands back in her lap. So without sounding too cliché, he said, turning to face her, are you heading to Belize for business or pleasure? This was not a question she was expecting to have to answer. She was pretty good at dodging people back home. It had actually become quite an art form, but he had caught her off guard. I suppose pleasure? She answered as more of a question, really. He responded with a light laugh that made her smile. You don't sound too sure. Well, I'm sure I'll figure it out when I get there, she said with a small grin. How about you? She asked. Oh, I'm going down to meet some friends, do some sightseeing, maybe some scuba diving. I hear the scuba diving is amazing down there. Have you ever been? Scuba diving or to Belize? She asked. Either, I guess, he said. Well, neither then, she said, looking down at her hands. Are you meeting anyone down there? He asked with a hopeful sound in his voice. I don't think so, she said. He looked at her with a puzzled look on his face. You don't know? He asked. She must sound like a complete idiot to him by now, and she could feel her cheeks starting to color. She decided now was the time to start making things up. A friend of mine bought me a ticket to San Pedro, said it was amazing. I don't really know what to expect yet. Oh, I'm going to San Pedro too, he said, grinning. That is so cool. Well, you'll love it there. I've only been once before, but it was amazing. Satisfied that she no longer seemed like a complete freak who had no idea what she was doing, she smiled at him. Are your friends on this flight? She asked. No, they're already down there. Been there a week. I was stuck at work, he answered. Oh, that's too bad. What do you do? She asked, a little unsure of how she was making such casual conversation with a stranger. Oh, I don't want to tell you. You'll think it frighteningly dull, he said. No, I won't, really, she said, finding herself surprised that someone even cared what she thought. Well, right now I'm working part-time for my dad's law firm, just doing administration stuff while I finish college, he said. Oh, well, that's not dull, she said. Are you studying law, then? No, of course not. I have no intention of being a stuffy lawyer. All that paperwork would drive me insane, he said, realizing at that moment he had no idea what she did, and hoping he hadn't offended her. You're not a lawyer, are you? He asked sheepishly. She laughed. No, I'm not. I work at a hospital, doing mostly administration stuff, you know, dealing with paperwork, she said, smiling at him playfully. Well, I have nothing against paperwork, per se. I'd just rather deal with people, I guess, than paper, he said, looking down at his lap. Yeah, I can understand that. My job wasn't my first choice, but it's convenient for me and I like it well enough, she said, biting her lip, feeling a little uncomfortable with so much focus on her. She was ready to change the subject. So what are you going to school for? I'm not sure yet. I'm having a hard time deciding, he said. She wasn't sure if this was a dodge to her question as well, but given her own ambiguous nature, she decided not to pursue it any farther. As if sensing her need for an interruption, the flight attendant walked by and asked if they wanted anything to drink. They both gladly accepted. Chapter 5. The flight had gone by pretty quickly with the friendly and unexpected conversation, and before she knew it, they were landing in Belize. It was a little after 10 a.m., and given that she hadn't slept much in the last 24 hours, she was feeling a bit tired. But it was a brand new day, no time to sleep. She had absolutely no idea what to expect now that she was actually there. As they were departing the plane, Ian asked how she would be getting to San Pedro. "What do you mean, how am I getting there?" she asked, feeling suddenly panicked. "Well, you can fly, or take a water taxi. Which are you doing?" he asked. "Wait, there's a boat?" she said, feeling rather irritated that there had been another option besides air travel, and that she had been given yet another plane ride. "I'm flying," she answered, making it pretty obvious she wasn't pleased about it. "I am too," he grinned. "Care if I tag along with you?" he asked. "Sure," she smiled, surprisingly relieved at the unexpected company. "Do you know where you're staying in San Pedro?" Yet another question she hadn't expected to have to answer, so she simply said, "I do, but I can't remember the name." Unsure as to whether or not that was a brush-off, he said a little disappointedly, "Oh, okay then." They walked in silence to the next gate and made small talk until it was time to board the plane. They weren't seated together, but the plane was fairly empty, and the flight attendant said she didn't mind if they sat by each other. Not terribly looking forward to yet another flight, Ethne's nerves started to get the best of her again. Ian could tell right away and did his best to distract her with conversation. "So what are you going to do when you get there?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Honestly, I'm so tired I kind of want to sleep," she replied. "Oh, bad idea," he said. "I'm assuming by the looks of it you don't travel much?" "No, not at all, actually," she answered. "Well, either way, I'm sure you've heard of jet lag. Sleeping after such a long trip is what you may feel like doing, but it's definitely not what you want to do," he said. "Oh," she said, a little crestfallen. "But if you like, I can help keep you company until later this evening," he asked, with another hopeful look in his eyes. "I'm not meeting my friends until later." She really wasn't used to this kind of attention. She wasn't sure what to say, and besides that, the note had been very specific. But how was she going to turn down such a kind offer? She wasn't accustomed to letting someone down, at all, let alone nicely. "I'd love that, really, but honestly, I'm not really sure where I'm headed. My friend basically told me to fly here and that there would be a cab waiting for me. I'd hate to take you out of your way if my hotel happens to be a long distance from where you're staying," she added with as much reassurance as she could that she wasn't just trying to get rid of him. She had actually been enjoying his company quite a bit. "Oh, I see," he said, trying his best to understand this mysterious woman's answer. "Well, that's okay." Their conversation had taken up the entire plane ride, a short 15 or so minutes. She was thankful it was over and appreciative that Ian had distracted her once again. As they got off the plane, she could tell that he had really hoped to continue talking to her. She actually had hoped the same, but her next plans weren't really up to her. "Well, here, let me at least give you my number where I'm staying," he said, scribbling his number on a part of his brochure. He tore it off and handed it to her. "If you find yourself wanting some company, or you would like to join my friends and me any time, you're welcome to," he said, smiling. "Thank you, that's awfully kind," she said, smiling back. "Well, it was nice to meet you. Maybe I'll see you around." He smiled and waved goodbye to her and turned to make his way outside. "Yeah, you too," she smiled back as she watched him go. She had felt rather comforted having him close by during the flights. She was a bit sad to see him go even though they had just met and she didn't really know him. Alone again, Ethne unzipped her bag and put his phone number safely inside, hoping that maybe later she could actually take him up on his offer. It was a strange feeling meeting someone new and not instinctually keeping her distance, but everything about the last day or so had been strange and new. When she glanced back up, she noticed a man holding a sign with her name on it. She walked over to him and told him she was Ethne. He smiled at her and handed her another envelope. It was small and plain and had only a short message inside. "This was your first test. You passed." Test? She thought. I was being tested. She wasn't sure why, but that made her kind of angry. Maybe it was just because she was extremely exhausted and really hungry, but this little game, apparently, was getting a little old. She had just traveled for 12 hours on 2 planes to a foreign country. She was ready to find out why. She put the note back in the envelope and followed the man out to a cab that was parked outside. It was nice not having to go to baggage claim, since she only had the one bag, but she was actually a little disappointed at the thought that she might not see Ian again. The man took her bag and opened the door for her. She climbed inside, having absolutely no idea where he was taking her. The room key had been unmarked, perhaps on purpose, who knows. Either way, she didn't know what hotel she was going to, or even if she was going to a hotel. She started to feel a little uneasy. As he pulled away from the curb, all she could do was hold her breath and stare out the window, hoping she had made the right decision to come here. The view out her window was spectacular as they drove steadily through the countryside, passing beautiful beaches, palm trees, and seeing nothing but the most beautiful blue water she had ever seen. Her brochure had told her that this was Ambergris Key, the largest island of Belize. It didn't really matter, though. She still had no idea where she was going and what she was doing here. It hadn't been very long since they had left the airport, and the driver was already slowing down and pulling into the driveway of a hotel. He didn't even bother to turn off the car. He retrieved her bag, handed it to her, smiled, and was gone before she could even thank him. She suddenly felt very alone. Even though he hadn't said a word to her during the drive, ever since she had met Ian on the plane, the rest of the trip hadn't felt quite as lonely. But she was used to being alone, so she shook off the abandoned feeling and started making her way up the path to the hotel. It was stunning. Actually, stunning wasn't even accurate enough. She hadn't traveled much, had pretty much spent her entire life in San Francisco, which, while having its own beauty, couldn't even compare to this. The hotel had a quaint spiral staircase with yellow trim leading to the balcony, and so many palm trees among the beautiful flowers that she found herself just staring in awe. And that didn't even include the breathtaking blue water that spanned from the pool all the way out to the ocean, which made the pool seem as though it simply went on forever. This is what people meant when they said paradise. She was incredibly disappointed that her trip here was going to be so short. She was set to head back Sunday morning, not nearly enough time to really revel in the beauty here. Sunday morning was going to come far too quickly. The Pelican Reef Villas Resort didn't look inexpensive by any means. The thought of how much this trip had to be costing crossed her mind for the first time. It had to have cost a fortune so far, a large sum paid for by a possible stranger, for a stranger? She couldn't fathom why anyone would do that. As she made her way up the cobblestone pathway to the lobby door, someone was coming out. She couldn't believe her eyes when Ian was staring back at her with a gigantic grin on his face. "Well, fancy meeting you here," he said, holding the door for her. "Hi," she said, unable to keep herself from smiling back. "This is very weird," he said. "Of all the hotels, although I think you can agree this has to be one of the most beautiful ones, yes?" "Yeah, it's amazing," she said. "Well, if we'd only known, we could have shared a cab," he said, grinning at her as she stepped past him into the lobby. She laughed nervously. "Yeah, if we'd only known." "After you check in, would you like to get something to eat?" he asked. Although she was very pleased to see him again, she knew that given the circumstances of her visit, having a new friend on the premises might complicate things. The instructions had been very clear. She wasn't to stray off course, and while she hadn't, it was pretty clear that the course may have other plans. She didn't particularly want to share with a stranger why she was in Belize. It was a very unbelievable and strange story. He would think her mad. It was highly coincidental that he was at her hotel, too, come to think of it, but it could be just that, a coincidence. She didn't want to add paranoia to her list of issues, so she did her best to put the idea out of her mind. She really did enjoy his company. Maybe there was a way to make both things work. What could be the harm in a bite to eat? "I'd love that," she said, "but I'm not quite sure of my plans just yet. Let me check in and get settled and get back to you?" "Oh yeah, sure, no problem. I'm in room 19, he said, waving goodbye to her. "Just come knock on the door if you're free." "Okay, I will," she said, smiling back at him. After he was gone, she turned and waited for the woman at the counter to come back. She hoped she wouldn't be long. Some